it's Becca from the Knitting Unicorn podcast, and this is Fiber 101, episode 1.5, which is about wool. I posted episode 1 yesterday, and upon editing and rewatching, I thought there was a few things I didn't talk about that maybe would be helpful. So I have a few things. This will be a shorter video, and if you have any questions, you can, or you want to learn more about anything specific, you can either comment below on the video, you can reach me on Instagram at the Knitting Unicorn, which I'll link below, or I have a Ravelry group called the Knitting Unicorn Podcast, and there is a thread called Fiber 101 where you can talk about the things that I talk about here, ask questions, or recommend things that you want to learn more about. So, that being said, we were talking about wool yesterday, and one of the things I didn't talk about that I specifically said I wasn't going to talk about, but then I realized it kind of needs discussing, was length and crimp of wool fiber. So crimp is when you see the fiber after it's been shorn, and it's literally crimped, like 80s hairstyle. Sometimes it's almost straight, sometimes it has a little wave to it, and sometimes it's really, really kinky. That's the crimp. And the more kinky, the more crimp that's in there, the softer and finer the yarn. So you would imagine that, a merino would be much more crimped. In fact, it would have up to 100 crimps per inch you could expect on a superfine merino, while a coarser wool might have only 6 crimps per inch, or even less. So that's important when you're learning about what makes a softer wool. That's more important for spinners, but it's also important to know as a knitter. The other thing, which is even more important, is the length or the staple of the fiber. Shorter fibers tend to be softer, and longer fibers are more coarse. And what that results in is shorter fibers are more likely to pill. So this is something that we didn't talk about, and this applies to more than just wool. It applies to all fibers, but definitely protein fibers, as you tend to have shorter fibers in some of those areas. So merino, cashmere, alpaca, I think camel as well, they all have a short staple length, and that's what makes them delicate and easy to pill, whereas longer and coarser wools, they don't really pill so much. So when we talk about, using a non-merino or a more rustic wool for something that you want heirloom quality out of, that's one of the things that's important, is pilling. So that's really important to know about. I mentioned in the last episode that I had that garment, that poncho garment I made that was supposed to be made out of wool, and I didn't realize that mattered, and so I made it out of alpaca, and it got all fuzzed and pilly, and I couldn't wear it at all because that was not an appropriate use for alpaca. So I will talk more about the length of different fibers in future episodes, but just be aware that shorter length or shorter staple means it's much more likely to pill and fuzz up easily. And merino is one of those short length fibers. I wasn't going to talk about specific breeds of wool, of sheep but I thought it would be important to talk about a few important ones, especially because I talk about merino a lot. And also because we talked about wool sensitivity and things that you can do. And one of the things I didn't mention is using lamb's wool. So I want to just take a few minutes to talk about Merino, Shetland, and lamb's wool, and Icelandic wool as well. Because those are very popular wools, and I think it's important just to know a little bit more about where they come from. So let's delve into that. So I'll put pictures of the different types of sheep in here in between each section so you can see what they look like. But Merino is a type of wool that actually comes from different breeds of sheep. Merino isn't a specific breed of sheep. There's about 10 breeds of sheep that produce merino wool, and some of the really popular ones are Australian, Pepin, Saxony, Rambouillet, Vermont, and South African. I hadn't heard a lot of most of these, even though they're more well known, and maybe for spinners they are, but I've definitely heard of Rambouillet. That is one where you will see that specific breed mentioned on a label, a yarn label, because it is a breed that does produce such a fine merino that by calling it out, it makes the yarn a little bit more marketable and more expensive. The majority of merino sheep are raised in Australia and New Zealand in the mountainous regions. And one of the things about merino that makes it so popular, especially among hand dyers, is that it is naturally a very pure white color. It is great for hand dyeing because it just showcases the dye very, very nicely. And superwash merino actually makes that even better because the colors become more color fast. So that is merino. So the next one I want to talk about is Shetland wool. And Shetland comes from Shetland sheep, and that is a breed in the Shetland Islands off the northern coast of Scotland. And Shetland sheep produce a very fine, very lustrous wool that is very warm and lightweight, and it comes from the soft undercoat of the Shetland wool. They actually have an overcoat and an undercoat, and that undercoat is the soft kind. It's also available, true Shetland wool is only available in limited quantities, so it tends to be a little bit more expensive because it is coming primarily from those sheep in Scotland. For knitting, Shetland wool often refers to a fine and loosely twisted wool, and it's one of the finest and softest wools from any of the UK breeds of sheep. There's a lot of variability within the breed as well. You can have one flock that produces very, very fine, lustrous wool, and that same flock will also produce a much coarser yarn that's maybe more suitable for outer garments, maybe socks, and even tapestry yarn. So the sheeps themselves and the flocks, they can differ from each other greatly in what they're producing. It's one of those breeds that each animal is really individual, and they can differ greatly. The other thing that's interesting about Shetland sheep and their wool is that they range in colors from pure white to deep, deep black. There's about 11 official colors, and then there's different markings as well on top of that is recognized as, I guess, for show purposes and whatnot. But they have various colors, and those can work their ways into their into the yarn and change the color of it. Shetland wool is often used naturally, the natural color as well, and it's, I think, one of the only sheep. Yeah, it's one of very few breeds that actually can produce a pure black wool, and that can be really coveted. So then I wanted to talk about Icelandic wool. Generally, this is known as lopi. So when you hear people talk about lopi and lopi sweaters, they're talking about Icelandic wool from Icelandic sheep. They've developed a particularly dense coat to protect them against the harsh Icelandic climate. It's very windy and it can be cold and wet and dry in different areas. It's a harsh climate. So their coats have been not developed, but over time have developed to be very dense. And this wool is very, very warm, very warm. It's very sturdy, and it's water repellent. And the underhair in this fleece is very soft and fleecy, I guess. And what they do is, oftentimes when a sheep breed has an overcoat and an undercoat, they're not spun together. They're spun separately. The Icelandic wool, the lopi wool, it's spun together, the coarse and the soft. And that creates, you do that to create the lopi roving yarn. And it's very dense, and if you've ever worked with lopi, you can feel it. It's different. And those sweaters made from lopi wool are crazy warm. Like, you only want to wear those in the coldest of climates because they are just incredibly warm. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about lamb's wool. So I mentioned that if you have sensitivities to wool, last time I said, using Merino or superwash or blends can be good. I forgot to mention lamb's wool. So lamb's wool is, first of all, it's the highest quality wool available that you can buy. So it is going to be a little pricey. What it is it's taken from the sheep at its very first shearing, usually around 7 months old. And it's incredibly soft, it's incredibly smooth, it's resilient, it's elastic. And because of this silky softness, it's used for garments that are going to be worn close to the skin. And it's also one of the most hypoallergenic yarns. I don't really know why this is. I was looking into lamb's wool earlier today to prepare for this, and that was one of the things I read about. I don't know if it's because I mentioned in the last episode that the scales in the wool can make it not conduct static, it resists static electricity, and I don't know if that contributes to the lamb's wool being as hypoallergenic as it is, but basically lamb's wool repels dirt and dust mites, so it makes it much more hypoallergenic, and it's even used sometimes for bedding because of that. So lamb's wool is definitely a great option for people who have allergies and people who have sensitivities to wool. So that's pretty much it for this little half episode. I just wanted to make sure that I covered everything in depth for you. And yeah, so next time you see me on Fiber 101, we will be talking about cashmere and Angora goats. So once again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And I will also see you this weekend for episode 5 of the Knitting Unicorn podcast. So please subscribe and stay tuned. Bye.